All right, welcome back to our discussion of the ADM. We completed the most important part of the ADM by covering the objectives. Anyone using TOGAF's ADM really needs to know the objectives very well. Why is that? Well, for one reason, if I were to say to you that let's just cut out the preliminary phase of the ADM, you should say, well, wait a minute, you can't do that because, right? That's what's giving you your EA capability. You say, okay, well, let me cut out phase E, opportunities and solutions. You go, wait a minute, you can't do that because that's where we're trying to come up with a roadmap and we're trying to figure out if we're going to do transition architectures or not with the identified work packages. So you should build fluency in the objectives. Why does each phase exist, right? Why don't we just have one big blob in there and call it the ADM? Right, so each phase has a reason for being. Now, as we move forward, we want to discuss other aspects of the ADM approach besides why each phase exists. So we'll go into how we have steps that provide the prescriptions for action in each phase. And then we'll talk to how content comes in again and how we keep track of the inputs and outputs of the method as we move through each phase. And then after that, we will also tie back into how the ADM integrates with all the other main parts of TOGAF. So each phase in TOGAF has steps. Again, think of those as like prescriptions. This is what TOGAF tells you to do in preliminary phase. There are 6 steps, which include scoping your practice, setting up your team, picking your architecture principles, selecting your tools. So that's just a paraphrasing of the steps in the preliminary phase. In phase A, there'll be steps about how do I establish an actual architecture project and define scope and get a statement of work approved. Right? Because those steps are aligned with why each of those 2 phases exist. And we have the same type of approach for the other phases. So for BCD, for example, we have 9 steps, the same steps, because it's a pattern in terms of how do we define the gaps between our baseline and target, and then what do we do with that information. So it's a repeatable pattern for B, C, and D, since they're like siblings looking at the architecture just from different perspectives. And again, different stakeholders would have different concerns looking at the business layer, information systems layer, looking at the technology layer. So they have different concerns. They'll need to have different questions answered. And so steps will help us to do that. So in B, C, and D, we want to look at what are the particular steps or the highlights of the particular steps. For example, the first step is to select reference models, viewpoints, and tools. That's for B, C, and D. Select reference models, viewpoints, and tools. So that's saying, per our discussion earlier of the enterprise continuum, the fact that it gives us the big picture for our context for doing architecture work. And also we talked about how in our smartphone for hotel key scenario that we might have a reference model of how to do business. What's the business reference model for hotels? So that would be very relevant here. What would be the big picture for us then to consider what building blocks need to change, and how would we describe those building blocks, and with what tools could we describe those building blocks? So again, the first step is very much aligned to what we were discussing earlier, the big picture, the different perspectives, and then what tools would we use. So that's important for B, C, and D, because we want to use the same, we want to have reference models in mind and the visuals in such a way, or the viewpoints and visuals in such a way that we could connect them to a bigger picture, and also the tools in terms of how is that information being stored, and could models that we're creating and views that we're creating from these different perspectives, they can all be connected to help us gather gaps in a meaningful way, which help us gather requirements to get to our target architecture, to get to our vision. So the next couple steps then, besides select reference models, viewpoints, and tools, we need to develop the baseline architecture description and the target architecture description in order to do a gap analysis. Now we could do the target first if that was really our main focus, and go back to the baseline. What we really need, the key step there, the really key step for BC&D is perform your gap analysis. That is the center of gravity for BC&D, because we're trying to define the gaps in order to define the requirements, all linked back to stakeholder concerns, all linked back to the vision that we're trying to achieve in our planning here in the ADM. Phases A through F. We're trying to define what would it take to get to that vision, and en route to getting to the vision, we need to come up with some candidate roadmap components, as we discussed before. Objectives for BC&D were to define the target architecture and come up with some candidate roadmap components to fill the gaps. Well, the steps reinforce that. So after performing gap analysis, define your candidate roadmap components. Then you want to understand those roadmap components in light of your whole architecture landscape, so you can resolve impacts across the architecture landscape. So you're saying, okay, well, we need to have a remote receptionist for our hotels. You go, well, that could have a ripple effect across how we're doing business in all our hotels. So we need to sort that out with all our other legacy building blocks, as well as any other planning that we're doing. So we can't just solve these problems in a siloed, isolated way. So that step is resolve impacts across the architecture landscape before we go to our stakeholder and say, look, we've defined the gaps in business, data, application, technology. We've come up with some ideas on how to actually accomplish this feat of smartphones for hotel keys, and to do it in a way that would give you your objective of making money in the millennial group in the first year, and so on and so forth. Well, you do want to have quite a bit of mastery of your architecture landscape in order to make those claims, because the stakeholder is going to review your claims and hopefully say, go forth and go ahead and complete your modeling for those areas, so that we can start sharing that information with confidence to the other people on the team and to our other stakeholders. So we create the main deliverable for the BCD area, and that's called the architecture definition document. And that's the final step, create the architecture definition document. So quick review, you select your reference models, viewpoints, and tools so that you have the context and you're going to be able to connect your visuals, and that you're using interoperable tools. And include tools, including your architecture repository, of course, in terms of where you're going to store things and be able to reuse your views and your models. So baseline, target, gap. What are my candidate roadmap components? What impact would they have across my landscape, and how would I resolve those impacts? All right, now we go to my stakeholder to get a review, to finalize my architecture work in each of these domains, and to populate my architecture definition document with all the findings, with all the views and the gap discussions and so forth. And from that architecture definition document, I can then create another very important derived document, and that would be my architecture requirements specification document. So we're just drilling down on BC&D here to show you the actual steps, because this is the heart of the matter in terms of your work as architects, is to say, what are the gaps and how could we fill those gaps in a logical manner, and then we need to be able to communicate that in a report with visuals that can be used to help derive requirements, so that when we move on from BC&D, then we can select work packages and sequence them in a way that's going to help us best meet our architecture vision. So we have the same approach in every phase, that we have steps that are repeatable, and we'll talk about tailoring these things later, but we have these prescriptions on how to do each phase. It just so happens that B, C, and D have the same steps, so we went ahead and reviewed those steps in more detail. The architecture content framework complements the ADM, as we said, and actually the architecture content framework was added to TOGAF 9 from version 8, and is a very nice addition because it standardized what kinds of reports, if you will, would be required for different phases and overall in the ADM, and then what kind of visuals would go in those reports. So it's very nice addition. TOGAF has a very simple way to track the movement from a draft version, which is a high-level outline, to a more granular version, which is a 1.0. So we're moving from a 0.1 to a 1.0. So in the material, as we see work products moving in and out of each phase, they are marked either 0.1 or 1.0. All right, so I'll give you an example of this as we move through phase A, the architecture vision. The architecture vision document contains 4 deliverables related to the 4 domain architectures at a high level. So the architecture vision document contains the 0.1 versions of the business architecture, data architecture, application architecture, and the technology architecture. The baseline and target 0.1 versions. So that's a very good example because it shows that we just have a high-level outline understanding of the architecture in those different domains as we're setting up our architecture vision. And as we're going to move forward, of course, we're going to move to 1.0 versions for these different domain architectures. For phase B, for example, we're expecting to come out with the business architecture 1.0, which is saying that we move to where the stakeholder has reviewed and approved the business architecture. And then we move into phase C. We have the data architecture 1.0, the application architecture 1.0, and then we move to technology architecture, and we have version 1.0 of technology architecture. Now that's just a way to do the marking of the flow in TOGAF, which is generic. You can change these. You could say, for example, I want the 1.0 version of technology architecture to move into phase C before I commit to my data and application architecture versions 1.0. But this is a notation. It's either a 0.1 or a 1.0, and it's a fundamental part of how we show the flow of the life cycle of deliverables. But actually, to manage deliverables in an actual EA effort, you need to do version control. So you need to distinguish between the idea of version control for actually doing your own architecture work tied to any of this information with the flow that is outlined here as a basic in TOGAF, the 0.1 or the 1.0, as we show movement between phases. Where this is also important in terms of version control is that we are iterating throughout the ADM. So as we iterate, then we're going to get different versions of, say, the business architecture, data architecture, application architecture, technology architecture. So we have to keep actual version numbers of these so that if I'm, for example, working in opportunities and solutions, phase E, I want to make sure I have the right version of the business architecture. Not that it's 0.1 or 1.0. That's not significant to me. I want to know what is the actual version, right? So there's the book notation, and then there's the real versioning. So it's just important to keep in mind that TOGAF can't help you with your real versioning. It's just showing you the general flow as you go from outline to actually reviewed and somewhat finalized approaches for further work in terms of how would I pick solutions to satisfy those defined gaps that the stakeholders have agreed to. In each iteration of the ADM, a fresh decision must be taken as to what's the breadth of the coverage of the enterprise that we're defining, how much of the enterprise in effect. Are we going to do the whole enterprise, or are we going to do part of the enterprise? To what depth are we going? What's the level of detail that we're going to define as we're building out these different architectures from these different domains? What breadth, what depth, and then how much time do we have? Well, how much time are we covering? So the extent of the time period aimed at, including the number and extent of any intermediate time periods. Are we talking about just one baseline to one target? Are we talking about over 3 years we're going to have multiple transition architectures? So the way we're chunking the work is also very important in terms of how we're going to be iterating between these different architecture domains: business, data, application, and technology. So once again, for iterating, what breadth, what depth, how much time do we have, and then with that in mind, which domains are we going to cover? So an acronym that we use that's also covers the 4 domains of TOGAF: business, data, application, and technology, or BDAT, also ties to the consideration of iterations. What breadth, what depth, what architecture domains, and how much time do we have? Another consideration for iteration is, where am I getting all this information? So you may not be just getting the information for iteration from just one cycle. It could be from other cycles. It could be from your research material about what's happening in industry. So iteration is a complex undertaking, and of course needs to be done more and more effectively as you mature your practice.